Great. We'll have recordings up online in case anyone misses one session. So just a little bit of background before I introduce you to our first guest speaker for this series. The Community Scholars Program is modeled after a very long-standing, well-known program from the Kentucky Arts Council of the same name, called the Community Scholars Program there too. And the purpose of this program is to recognize that the experts of communities across Arkansas are the community members themselves. It's not me as a folklorist at AFTA. It's not even the folks at the libraries. You all are the experts of your communities. And so this program exists to share skills, tool sets, honestly, to share sort of the language that we use. So you all know what kind of language we use with the kind of work that we do. And through that, to create a network of folks across the state who are interested in documenting their community's traditions and stories. So my vision is like the Kentucky Arts Council. They have hundreds of scholars now at this point across the state who can lean on each other, rely on each other for collaborations and ideas and things like that. So that's my vision for this program. And you all will be the first alumni of the first session.
Wow.
Yes, thank you all. And if you all ever pursue, for instance, like a National Endowment for the Arts grant, they recognize the title of community scholar. So there's some weight to this training. So if you pursue projects, this is a credential of sorts. So I'll make sure you have like a completion certificate at the end to show that you've completed this process with us. And then I also just wanted to note and thank the team at Cherokee Village for the team for the Our Town grant, because I think this process is particularly timely in the city of Cherokee Village as well, because for the Our Town grant to be successful, it needs to rely on community support and input. So programs like this make sure that Cherokee Village citizens and stakeholders, even without outside of Cherokee Village, can be a part of the process. And so just a brief overview so you see where we're headed. If I can do Zoom and PowerPoint at the same time. Okay, so tonight I'll introduce Rachel Reynolds here in a moment. She's going to kick it off with an overview of folk and traditional arts. And then I'm going to introduce a form of fieldwork that we use to document traditions. Next Tuesday, so same time next week, we'll have Kara Flynn and Lori Burrell with the Division of Special Collections. We'll continue to talk about oral history interviewing, and we'll also talk about some equipment that the city of Cherokee Village has purchased to help community members in Cherokee Village do that kind of work. But then we'll also talk about archiving best practices. And then we'll finish up on the third session, which is the following Tuesday, again, same time, same place. Was talking about different ways that you can promote the work that you've done. So in other words, you've done some sort of research and you want to showcase it. It doesn't mean you have to do a ginormous exhibit at a museum. There are all kinds of ways of showcasing your work and promoting the traditions and stories of your community. So we'll talk about that. And then just a few quick notes. I have put all of the resources for this training session, all handouts, any links or references we give you, and even the course outline and the recordings after they happen will be at this website. And I'll make sure Angela has this as well so she can email it to all the participants. And then on that website, you can find this document, which I believe has already been shared with you. This will be our text per se for this training session. It's short, don't feel daunted. And I would just ask, I'll remind you again, I would ask that you'd read just the first 17 pages before session 2 next week. It's really going to mirror a lot of what we're already saying, but this document was prepared by the Library of Congress American Folklife Center, and it's just a great primer. And so without any further ado, I can never say metaphors or sayings. I want to introduce you to Rachel Reynolds. Rachel is the founder of Cultural Continuum Consulting and the executive director of the Arkansas Craft School in Mountain View, and just an all-around amazing folklorist working in Arkansas. And so I've asked her to really kick off this training today to talk about folk and traditional arts, what that means and why that's useful to you, and even to the Our Town grant. So Rachel, welcome. Thank you for being here.
She's controlling it.
Did I mute you, Rachel?
There we go.
Okay.
You're still muted.
Okay, I'm muted.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing real good. And I was thrilled that Virginia asked me to participate in this because I moved back home to Stone County from your area. So I was living in Couch right over the state line, and working and organizing food producers and artisans in Alton for a few years there. But I'm a fiddle player, and so I played in Mammoth, I played in Hardy. I think I was the last fiddle player in the iteration of the Arkansas Traveler Theater in that last round. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth there. So I was tickled that you all got this grant, and I got a grant. I got an Our Town grant in Alton. We had one in Alton that we did, and also I got one in Fayetteville. And so I was familiar with the program, and thrilled that you all got one for your area. So kudos for that.
Now, Rachel, would you like us to introduce who we've got in the room so you know who is participating tonight?
Yeah, so I might know somebody because I was looking at your cultural asset list, and I was recognizing people and stuff. So yeah, I'd love to know who's in the room.
Yes, definitely. So my name's Angela Phipps, and I'm actually an art teacher at Melbourne High School, but I also sit on the board for the Spring River Innovation Hub and am part of the Our Town grant.
Wonderful.
Hi, Rachel. I'm Jonathan Rhodes. I am a longtime resident here in Cherokee Village, and my family became the community developer here about 9 years ago. Kind of carrying on the tradition of the Cooper family that started this. And so we're so excited to have you, and also just to have this grant, which has just been a wonderful tool for us.
Great.
Hey, Rachel, I'm Nana Doherty, and my family's been in the Hardy area a long time. I'm associated with the Arts Center of North Arkansas, which is a primary partner with the city of Cherokee Village as a nonprofit. And I'm also associated with the Hardy History Association. And we were wanting to have a program about the Arkansas Traveler with Debbie Sanders. So I know somebody you know. I don't know if it's
Cool.
Yeah. So it's good.
I have all their original papers.
Oh.
I was given their archival records, so I have stuff that can help you there.
All right then.
Wow. But before we go any further, let me say this right now, because so everybody knows, our other partner on this grant is the University of Arkansas Community Design Center. They're probably our biggest partner in terms of implementing the asset mapping process. And one of Steve Luone's colleagues, Trey, is going to be here the 14th, 15th, and 16th. So he's actually going to be here the second night that we have this. And Trey, they've not been able to travel because of COVID. So this is their first, we've been doing everything virtually. But Trey's going to be here, and we're going to have a session, and we're probably going to kind of overlap the sessions. But anyway, he's going to be sharing some of the mapping that they've been doing. And one of the reasons that he wants to come is he's particularly interested in the Traveler and that history. And so one of the things that I'm going to do between now and the 15th is set up some appointments for him to connect with as many people, because we've got a lot of local folks who performed that are still around.
Yeah.
They were high schoolers then. They're not high schoolers now, but they're still around, that they performed there. And then Ruth Ann Bettis, who was part of the retail sales, and I understand
Bill
that.
performed there.
And Bill, Patricia's husband, Bill, performed there. And I didn't realize, but I think there's a house on that site now. I don't know if y'all knew that, but
Huh.
converted into a house. And so anyway, I just wanted to plug that before we go too much further, because Trey would love to make some connections. So you just made some, and so we may follow up with you, Rachel, about that.
Sure, sure. And I'm also glad that Patricia's there, because I looked at the asset map and I saw Billy Joe and I was like, but what, yeah, she's got to be on here. So she's one of your great resources. So I'm glad she's in the room. I saw her there.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Sorry to interrupt.
Who else is in the room? There were some other folks in the room.
Let's see, so Becca, I think you're next.
Hello, I'm Becca Schaefer, and I teach history at Highland High School. I've only lived in the area for 6 years, but I'm ready to learn things about where I work and who I work with.
You said you teach what there?
I teach history.
History.
Wonderful.
Well, I'm Judy Brown, and I've been living in Cherokee Village since 1994. So I had family from here. We moved here in 1990 and lived in Hardy for the first 3 years, and then bought the house in Cherokee, and we've been in the same house since 1994. So I've known a lot of these people, have been to the Traveler many times. And
You're an artist too.
yeah, and I'm an artist. That's how I got pulled into this, is through the Art Center. And so
Great.
I'm Patricia French, and I was born just over the line in Thayer, Missouri, in Dr. Cooper's office, Mr. Cooper's brothers. And so I've kind of always been connected to this part of the country. I'm a bona fide hillbilly and proud of it, and was raised with the mother and grandmothers who taught me a lot about the land. I had a lot of plant knowledge, and then I worked for the Department of Conservation up in Missouri for almost 27 years, and was able to pursue that on with my job. I was a founding member of the Ozarks chapter of the Native Plant Society, and was heavily involved with Native Plant Society, more so with traditional plant uses and the folklore part of that. Also was on the Folk Culture Commission at Mountain View for probably 20 years, and till it disbanded, which is a whole nother story. But anyway, and was really involved with the Folk Center a lot. And I'm really happy to be able to, that was an outlet for me, and kind of went along with my past and my history. And I'm so excited that we're doing this in our area now. I've lived in the village or outside for 30 some years, and I have just waited and waited for an opportunity like this. So I'm really thrilled that we're doing this. It's wonderful.
It's great.
Hi, I'm Sandra Farnham, and I'm the president of the Art Center of North Arkansas. That's why I drag these other ladies here. And I'm thrilled to be here. My great-great-grandfather owned Bowman Hill, and my grandmother and my father were born there, and I was the first one in the family born in Northern Illinois, and finally got to move down here 6 years ago. And I am really enjoying finding out the real history and the things that you hear as a little girl, how much of it was true and how much of it was exaggerated. And I'm having a great time just discovering my family's history and all the history that goes along with everything here.
That's great. What a great concise group of people to have in the room. That's amazing. So y'all are ahead of the game. So that's good news. It takes all of these perspectives really to have a successful Art Town project. The way it's geared and the outcomes that they want from it, it takes all of these different perspectives at the table, and y'all have done a really great job at getting that group together. So that's fantastic. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about, Virginia asked me to talk to you about what folklore is. And I think you probably have a pretty good start on understanding it. Sounds like most of you have some sort of reference point, and maybe the only kind of component is about language, you know, like, because the thing about folklore is it is those things that we know and learn from each other. So not the things we learn from books. It's like Patricia was saying, you know, from generations of your family, from members in your community, and community can be defined in different ways, right? My definition comes from a fellow named Wendell Berry, who's from Kentucky, and his definition is a people and their place. And so when I think about my work in folklore and my work in community development and my work in art nonprofits, when I'm thinking about community, I'm always considering the land as an equal partner to the people. And so how do those things interact? And you can really gain a lot of knowledge by looking at the things people know about the land, as well as things they know about the other people, or the other things that people do in the community. So I would encourage you to think about that when you're thinking about what folklore is. You know, consider seasons, consider what grows when, and then what people do with it. You know, like that's kind of the evolution, that those things all hold together as a piece when you're thinking about what the community is. And is it Sandra, the last woman who introduced herself?
Yes.
So you made a good point too, that you were so interested to move back. You had these generational ties to this place, and now you're here and you're learning the history. And when you talk about history, you're talking about facts, right? You're talking about those things that can be proven.
Yeah.
When you're talking about folklore, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true or not, right?
Oh, I know a lot of that.
The stories that are shared, those stories that are shared and how they've changed over time, that's folklore. Whether there's a document in the census that can track all that and prove it, doesn't matter in folklore. Might be interesting to you or your group to unpack when you're thinking about especially presentation components and you want to back it up. But in terms of like being a community scholar and experiencing your community through the lens of folklore, you don't have to worry about whether it's true or not. You just are interested in what people know and what people want to share and what people want to highlight. I always use the analogy, and I should say, like, my folklore practice is pretty different than a lot of folklorists. It started out, I was what's called a public folklorist. I can't remember if that's in the library, those definitions are in the Library of Congress book or not, but it's a fantastic guide. But a public folklorist gathers information for the purpose of presenting it, interpreting it for the public. That might look like an exhibit, that might look like a festival, that might look like another kind of community gathering. And then there's kind of the academic folklorist that gathers all this information with the intent of writing about it and putting that out there, having it published and part of a record like that. I decided pretty early on when I was living in your area and I was going back and forth to Jonesboro. And so I was driving from Couch through Myrtle down to Dalton. That was the way I went. So, and you know, you go through Pocahontas. And Pocahontas is so interesting to me because it's one of those great places that's an example of what I was talking about in that connectedness of the land and the people and how that creates this culture. You can be driving in Pocahontas on that Dalton side, and you can be going literally Ozarks, 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 and you cross that Black River Bridge and it's flat as a fritter and you can say Delta, 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 Delta. It's both of those cultures in one town. And the kind of defining factor is that body of water. It's that watershed, that Black River. So I started thinking about that connectedness. And then I also started thinking about how I wanted my work as a folklorist, and I see this as a role that all of you can contribute to, was more than presenting, you know, my job was to go around and do field work, do interviews, and then to program this big festival in West Plains. I programmed the Old Time Music Ozark Heritage Festival there, which was fun. But at the end of the day, I was building these really deep relationships with people in 5 counties around there. And I was having to pick different ones to put on the stage one time a year for 45 minutes. And then the rest of the year, you know, and say, you're special. And then the rest of the year, they were back home and struggling, a lot of them. And so I saw my work as creating an environment in which those cultural traditions and those people of that community could flourish. And to do that, you have to look at different aspects. It's important to know the folklore and to know the history and to know the cultural assets. But it's equally as important to look at things like the economy. What resources are available to people that struggle? What are those challenges? You know, so like where I lived, which is similar to the, maybe not Cherokee Village proper, but the issues surrounding Cherokee Village have to do with income. If you look at people who are experiencing poverty, then you have to look at transportation. You have to look at food access, food security or insecurity, because at the end of the day, if somebody's hungry, they're not going to have time to play fiddle on the porch or at the Hardy Music Junction Music Hall. You know, they're going to be struggling to keep their family afloat. And so to me, all of those components play in together. So it's really important to have people at the table that are working on community development, for instance, to have that cultural point of reference, and that can guide their work. That can guide their work in truly knowing what community development needs to be and what's appropriate for the scale of their community and the people in their community. And you can look at that over time. And the way to figure that out is to be a community scholar, right? Like, you have these conversations. It's exciting that y'all have the opportunity to be a part of this first group for Arkansas. Like, how exciting is that? When I was working, Missouri had a really strong community scholars program. They still do. But yeah, Arkansas didn't have that resource, and y'all are just over the line. So like, I always like to think of a state of the Ozarks, which is arbitrary of state lines, right? Like, and this ties to that connection of land and people too. So if you're in Thayer, it's real similar to if you're in Hardy, you know, that makes more sense despite that arbitrary state line that's in between those two places, your people hang together. Like the way people experience life hangs together. The foods that they eat are similar. The music that they play is similar. That sort of thing. So it's important to think of your individual community in that context rather than its own independent thing. That being said, it's also important to think about the different components and aspects of your community. So as I mentioned, Cherokee Village proper, and I mentioned Hardy, and then I talked about that area surrounding those things. Like it's hard to say the rural area around Cherokee Village, but we know that there's a difference in what's available in Cherokee Village and Hardy, and then what's available in between those places. It's a different scale than most people think of, but there is a difference. And there's a different set of circumstances that created those places. So in terms of Cherokee Village proper, is that the focus of these stories, or is it the broader area? Is Cherokee Village proper a component of a larger story in your goals, or is it what your stated thing is that you're working on?
So Rachel, the goal is, when we look at the folklore and the folk period, we said we didn't want to start at 1954 when Mr. Cooper founded. So we said, let's look at four things. Let's look at the Native American history, because they were the first here on this land and on these rivers. Then let's look at the Ozark pioneer folk history of those folks who settled here after. Then let's look at the camping legacy, because the Boy Scout camps and the girls YMCA camp, those camps were formative in how the tourism industry formed here and who came here from Memphis on the railroad. And then let's look at mid-century development. So Mr. Cooper came here in the 40s. He started in 1954. He built the community in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And how did that mid-century development, how was that shaped by the three periods before? And then how does this community, is it reflected in this community today? Is it reflected in how we want to move forward? So the whole purpose for the grant for us was to say, Cherokee Village went through this development period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, really stopped developing in the 80s. And the development of this community really shaped the entire region. But how was this development shaped by the community itself of Hardy, of the river, the things that came before? And so in a way, this whole thing is, what is our identity as a community of Cherokee Village? How was it shaped by the past? Who are we today? And who do we want to be tomorrow? That's really the essence of the grant.
And you're part of the Ozarks.
And then also.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead, Grayson.
And Patricia rightly said, and we're also part of the Ozarks. So how does that, that regional, we're at the foothills of the Ozarks. So how does that place, how does that shape who we are and where we want to go? Because all of this is a first step in a comprehensive master planning process that we hope will then shape how the community develops in the years and decades moving forward.
Okay, so those are all really good questions, and I'm really glad to hear that you're going back to Native American history. I'm interested to know what resources you're looking at. But before I go back to that question, I think that this is going to be critical for y'all And it's challenging to a lot of rural communities that have economies that are steeped in tourism. But it's a critical analysis that y'all are going to need to do when you get to this component, because it's a huge part of your history and your folklore. Is how did the fact that Cherokee Village, Hardy, that area, its urban orbit was Memphis, right? There's that cultural exchange, which is really different. And if you look at the cultural history and the folklore of the Ozarks and the area around where you are, and you look at the history and the cultural aspects of Memphis, those two things are really different, right? So there's that exchange. So that's gonna, over time, that's gonna have affected the cultural traditions of your place, just having those folks come in. The other component of that, because I live in I work in Mountain View, I live in the forest, but I grew up in Mountain View, and the whole thing that set me on the whole path that I ended up going down was, and I grew up playing fiddle. The folk center was my playground. I walked there, I played all day, I'd walk home, I'd come back and play the shows at night. But that whole town's economy is focused on cultural tourism. And it bothered me as I saw the evolution of these places that I loved, because what ends up happening is when your economy is based on tourism, you're selling to somebody that's not your people, right? So then you have to shape what's going on in your community to be marketable to this other audience, which doesn't always take into account the needs and realities of the people that are living in your community every day. I often use the analogy of, and it was the norm, it was the goal. It was the norm and the goal through the 90s. It's been the norm and the goal for a long time. And the answer to so many rural communities' economic problems was, let's attract tourists. Let's have this thing because we know tourists will come and they'll spend their money. But you must look at how that affected the culture of your place. And as you look forward into the way things are and the way things you're imagining for the future, you need to take a good hard look on those changes. And if that's something you want to invest in, here's my theory, and this is how I work and what I tell my people. Now that I've had the blessing to be able to move back home and do the thing I've wanted to take all those lessons and come back to my home community that meant so much to me, is that if you think about community development through an art and culture lens, like I do, if you do it, if you figure out strategies, development strategies, which should include this deep dive, generational deep dive into the culture. But if you think about strategies that are appropriate, given what you learn, to the people that live there every day, and you make your strategies focused around that, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be completely unique to your community. It's going to be sustainable, and people will come, right? People will come. They'll be attracted to that, but you're flipping the script on who you're putting the program, project, development strategy together for. And it tends to work out really good because you get a lot of community buy-in. You get a lot of community participation, and it opens the door for people who have historically been denied access to the decision-making table. People that have not felt empowered to participate, and they've got talents that they can bring to your project. And if they feel like it's theirs, there's this huge community pride, and people show up. People show up in ways that are better than you could even imagine. So I'm just going to throw that pitch in there for because I'm not on the future sessions where you're talking strategy, but I've just got to say that because in a lot of ways, the economy of the historical economy of Mountain View and of Hardy and Cherokee Village are really similar in that aspect, you know, and the Arkansas Traveler is a fantastic example of that story. If you follow the history of the Arkansas Traveler through its demise in 2000, whatever, when I was there, like that's a cautionary tale of exactly what I'm talking about, right? Y'all know what happened. Y'all know.
I don't think everybody knows. Actually, I think that history is lost. We're losing that history here. I think a lot of people, one, don't even know that the Traveler existed. I think a lot of people don't even know the story of the Traveler to begin with. Number two, I think that a lot of people don't know that the Traveler was here, the performance and why it was here, and the story of Leo Rainey. I'm not sure that people know. I think that history is being lost.
And how big it was.
And how big it was.
How, you know, where the people came from that came to that. But my feelings on that was that, and I know this from my career, we had this big generational change. And the audience that was coming there no longer could identify with the interpretation that was being done. And that's been a really big challenge, as you know, in what we do. And I know that was, you know, I remember talking to Leo Rainey, and that was the conversation that we had about it, that you know, we had kids that didn't grow up like we did.
They don't identify.
Right.
They couldn't identify, and you know, that's a really hard thing. I've been sitting here listening to what you're saying with interpretation, and I on this group, that's something I'm gonna, what you were just talking about is something that I'm adamant about, is that we don't lose what our culture was, but we have to find a way to interpret it for this generational change, but still maintain the facts and the folklore and all of those things.
Just look at Hardy. I go to Hardy at least once a week and work in Ruby's on Main with Darlene and Charles. And that is a history lesson in itself, to go into a store that Charles Wilson is building, because for 60 years, he's collecting all of this stuff. So it's a history lesson in itself. But when I walk downtown Hardy, I'm saddened because there's a big tattoo parlor over here. I'm hoping the lounge that they put in is going to be a nice place for people to socialize. There's so many empty buildings, and this town center right here. I was just sitting here thinking myself of all the businesses that I know of in the 30 years I've been in the village that have come through here that I've been some part of. Maybe I just kept the books, or maybe I helped out a little bit, or I banked here when the bank was up on the upper level. But that has been lost. And tourism's not going to bring that back. It's just not. And so I agree with the point she was making, that our strategies going forward have to provide something that our people want to participate in, want to be a part of, want to help grow. And I know how difficult that is, because you've got the new generation that is not interested in the Traveler show. They're not interested.
Here's the thing though, they might be, it's how you frame it.
Yes.
Like
exactly.
if you frame the interpretation in the history and the culture of the traveler, because it's all those things. Like you could call the Arkansas Traveler over time a community. Think about the generations of people that performed in that from your community.
Yeah.
Think about documenting those stories. And what you do is when you start collecting these stories and you start talking to people and you start comparing your stuff, you're going to see what I call cultural nodes. You're going to see these things that rise to the top that are more in the memory of people that are still happening. Like, how many years has Billy Joe been playing at the fairground, right? Like, generations of stuff that's relatable. Those things that have lasted over time, that's where you start. And the other part is in a time that focuses on, is so hyper focused from every direction on otherness. That is a story, that's a component in a story of this. That whole Arkansas Traveler story is about otherness, right? From both sides. It's the hillbilly being the other, and it's the outsider being the other. So there's all sorts of opportunities to unpack that and tell that in the interpretation. And I guarantee you, there are young people that would contribute and be happy to have conversations. And I will come, like, that's my bag, is to have these facilitated conversations and figure out how to unpack that. And I can do that with young people, but you also have to be able to do what I said, in that you think about your table, you expand your table by empowering these, I'll use the example of these young people, to participate in equal part, right? So they are, from that conversation would come these components that are interesting to the young people. And then if you allow them into your group and your table and give them a voice in how things move forward, you're going to hear from them what resonates, and you're going to hear from them what they'll buy into and help with, you know. And so I'm not saying that they can necessarily have the context to do a master plan or to, you know, even lead or drive a community development, but they're going to answer your questions about, you know, like how to engage them, how to get them to be a part of this, how to get them to show up. And so, yeah, that's how you do it, is you ask them, you unpack it with them. And then you see, again, those cultural nodes that keep showing up. There'll be, I always use the analogy of the 4-burner stove. You know, everybody's got a favorite burner, which I had never considered until last month, because I just assumed I've been using this analogy for years. And I never assumed that everybody's favorite burner wasn't the front right burner. But come to find out, some people like the front left better. But I use that analogy of, okay, you're making candy. That's on your favorite burner. Mine's front right. Because you got to stand right there. You got to stand on top of it and do it. And then over here, you've got some potatoes boiling or some meat frying. And then on this back one, you've got some peas that are simmering. And then on this other one, you've got going, you know, like this front thing is the thing that you, through your interviews, through your conversations, it will come to the top. It'll just naturally rise to the top. What people are most excited about, what they want to see, that will become evident to you, I promise, as you go through this process. And that's where you focus your energy first. But you know that these other things are going on on and they need your attention too. Candy's done, you move your other one over and you start working on that, and you put another one on the empty burner. And yeah, and it's a really fascinating process. And so I'm interested, I'm so interested to hear what you guys hear, you know. That's really, I can't wait to listen to what you collect. And it's so great that your city's now going to have this equipment. So this community start with you, and then it can go in the schools. It can go in the library. It can become a thing that anybody that wants to talk and have something on record can come in and do themselves. If they don't want to be interviewed, but they want to tell something, they can tell it. If it needs to be anonymous, because that's the thing, when we're looking at histories of places, like people that are still alive from families that weird stuff happened, you know, frequently people don't want to talk about those things publicly until everybody that has that generational memory has died, and it's not going to be an issue. If there's an anonymous way that people can tell these stories, that plays into your history too. You know, these are all important components, but I think you'll be amazed. And going back to the, because she asked me to do this, I was like, has anybody unpacked why this was called Cherokee Village and why all the streets are named after, like is anybody talking about that? And she said that y'all were going to be looking into those things, and it made me so happy. I mean, that's not just your area, that's all over the Ozarks. It's really hard to find nation written materials about the Native American population in our region. I hope y'all are connected with the Osage Nation. They've got great resources. They've got a website. They've got language courses. They've got all of these things that you can't, of course, Cherokee, but the Cherokee came later than the Osage. The Osage were our original peoples. And even further back, there are resources. There's a handful of books, and I tell you where they're at because I bought them all. I ran the library, little public library there in Myrtle, right over the state line, and I made an Ozark section, and I bought all the materials, all the academic materials about Native Americans in our area, and you can check them out at the Myrtle Library. So yeah, go get those. And there's some really great about the Ozarks, talking about cultural geography, talking about all aspects of history and folklore, and they're geared towards your area. So that's a whole section.
That also is a good chance to do some interpretive work that would also tie in with tourism, because that would be a draw to people. Even if I would love to see a museum sometime that had a lot of emphasis on the Native American part of it, but on other things too. But I think that we would be a challenge to interpret that to tourists, because
When I
that's
first got
one
here,
reason why they
there
come here.
was a museum in this complex that was a Native American museum.
Then it moved over here by the Copper Yeah.
And I don't know where it went from there, but I know there was a museum here.
There was a gentleman who was particularly.
Was that Mr. Wolf?
That was driving a Chuck?
No, not Chuck Wolf. No. This was WOLF.
I think I'll ask that, but there was a man driving, the driving force behind that.
There was an older gentleman named Wolf, and he was a Native American from here.
That's something though, that even if you had a handout or something in the realtors did, or whoever is renting or selling to people in the village. I have a client that has a house, and she's one I'm gonna try to get interested in coming, who's trying to keep the homes in the mid-century modern. We're leaving original tile and things in the homes. And I found a signal tree behind the house, and I told her, it's an Airbnb. And I said, be sure that you put something on the wall about this signal tree. If you know what that is, it was a tree that was usually bent for various reasons. And I think it definitely is. And again, it's like folklore. If it's not, it's still okay. We can call it an interpretation.
Yeah.
And I'm using that as a selling point for this Airbnb. There's just so many things you can do. You know, that's
until you said that, you know what I hadn't thought about this in years. Do you remember all the arrow signs that used to be on
Yeah.
the trees around the
Yeah.
village? I just remember that as a kid, seeing those and not knowing.
wish we had pictures. I hope somebody
Yeah.
had pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, that's just a small little thing.
Well,
Seizing on an opportunity to make that a selling point for the, a little selling point for the Airbnb.
Yeah. Rachel, I wanted to say it's Jonathan.
so here's,
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say just real quick, just like somebody called me and said, I've got all the original papers for the Arkansas Traveler. I don't know what to do with them. Do you want them? And I took them because I didn't want them to be, somebody has all the stuff from that Native American History Museum. And between y'all, you can find out who that is. You'll have all the components at the table to figure out that mystery. And how cool would that be to have that, one of the most fun things about folklore is that you go in with, you learn about one person, right? I'm gonna use fiddle as an example, but somebody says to you, you really should go play with so-and-so, he's got a bunch of good tunes. And I say, okay, and I show up at so-and-so's house and we play fiddle tunes for 3 hours. By the end of that 3 hours, I know 150 other fiddlers in the area. Because as you have these conversations with people, that's another thing I am referring to, the cultural node. If you can find that one person, Billy Joe would be a really great example here. Is if you find that one person, they know all of these layers, right, that are currently happening. And then they probably know all these layers of what have happened before. And so if you can think of between you somebody in the community that's particularly interested in Native American history, probably are going to be a node for anybody else that's, and you'll find whoever's got this stuff. And it'll be a really fun process. It'll be so fun. Yeah. Did you have something to say? I've interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's Jonathan. I wanted to say a couple things. One is, of all the things that I've done in the 9 years I've been back, this Our Town grant is the most exciting, frankly, because it just brings together so much of what so many of us are passionate about. And we're really just on the beginning of this grant. I mean, it's been going on for months, but I just really feel like there's so much potential and so many people for us to bring to the table. And I wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I want to invite you to come at some point, and we'll get with Grayson and Angela and get you, let's do a whole session just on the Arkansas Traveler and let you lead that, because I think having someone not local kind of facilitate that could be really helpful. And we could just have one night where we just focus on that and just bring as many people together, because we've got, you know, Deanna Strobe and people who performed in it. BJ, you know, just have people come out and share their stories, but also you kind of help interpret that, you know, the history of it, but also what it meant for the community. You know, what I always remember about the Traveler was, you were talking about tourism, and I want to say this because I don't want us to be afraid of tourism, because tourism is very important. And the reason that the Traveler existed and really survived was because of tourism. And it was really because of the tourism that Mr. Cooper brought. So when you came in here for your 2-night, 3-day, one of the things you got were tickets to go to the Traveler. And so all those people that came, it was a part of, the tourism and marketing here. But Mr. Cooper came as a tourist, really, in a way. I mean, the camps got him here and his son, but that tourism piece is a lot of our history. And so, and really, just to say on the tourism side is, I really believe that tourism will help us rebuild our economy here. Because if you think about when people relocate somewhere, almost always it starts with tourism. Rarely does somebody move somewhere that they haven't visited before. So what happens is you visit a place as a tourist, or because you're maybe a family connection, but even as a family, if you're visiting family, you're a tourist. And that tourism is the door that opens up to let you into a community, and you begin to see something that you like, you vacation there, eventually you move there. And so tourism was the force that brought the development of the village and so much of our economy. And it will be something that we can use to shape the future. But I think your words of caution is, how do we do that so that we don't wake up one day and say, well, we don't even know who we are. And frankly, that's really what's behind this Our Town grant, is because when we look at the village 65 years later, who are we? Tens and tens of thousands of people from all over the country have come through this village and left their mark here, but they've died and gone on. And a lot of us haven't even preserved that wonderful history of the last 65 years of all these families who came through here. And so in a way, we're struggling with our identity. So I think this grant helps us figure that identity out, so that as we go forward and build a new tourism economy, we've not lost more of that identity.
And here's what I'm gonna say to that, is I'm not saying to be scared of tourism and throw it out with the bathwater. What I'm saying is to think of it in ways that holistically support your community and its culture first. That for your community and the people that live there every day, after you learn who you are, people will come and people will appreciate that authenticity rather than the general model, which is, what can we do with what we have to sell it to these other people that aren't anything like us? What do they want to see? What are they going to come here to see? Like, that's a totally different way of thinking about it. And it's not sustainability of mountaintop removal. It's the same thing, but you're talking about the culture. It's eroding. It's just like taking it off and changing it to sell it and market it to another person. You don't have to do that. You can do tourism a different way, in a way that's not going to leave your community trashed, because people are coming in, they might get gas, they might stay in a hotel, they might come to a show or a restaurant or whatever, they're going to go home. There's a different way to cultivate who comes. There's a different way to cultivate what they're coming for, that is true and authentic to who you are now and who you were before now, and doesn't take away from any component of the history of the place or the culture. Like it's that is the most marketable thing you have. Right? Like, if you do it right, it's a model for. And what are people the hungriest for these days? Right? The real things, the real place, the real people. And the way that you can have that for outsiders to come and enjoy is to ensure it for the people that live there every day. But I'm happy to come. I would love to come facilitate a conversation about the Arkansas Traveler, and I can bring visual aids. I have
And your fiddle.
and I'll bring my fiddle. Yeah, is it Billy Joe and Eddie? Eddie have to be there. I told U of A Special Collections. Joshua Youngblood that works there had told me that he was like, you have to promise me that your papers will come here. And I was like, yes. And then I just found that huge box of Arkansas Traveler stuff. So this is serendipitous, but my plan was to get that to, but before they have it and have it all in a safe repository that other people can use for research, I would love to bring it to Cherokee Village and share it with y'all and help y'all talk about it and find those stories and document those stories. And what a great story to be able to tell about your community too. But I've gone over my time. Does anybody have
That's okay. Yeah. Any questions for Rachel?
any questions, Virginia?
No, but I'll make one comment. We're talking about museums and that kind of thing. The Hardy History Museum just had their soft opening. They had 89 people go through there that listed their names and went through there. We've had people go through there on weekends before it even opened, and all were just, and it's not a big, not a big place.
I think people are hungry for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they want somewhere to take their kids they're not on their iPhone. I do, I have a grandson that's 10, and that I'm constantly challenged with that. And I don't think just because I'm old, I think younger parents are, doing that too. And people are hungry for that. And I've went through it. It's great. It's really
They have
great.
their official opening June 13th. So
We have a program at the Arkansas Craft School. I'll plug because you should bring your grandson, because I have a 10-year-old and they're on the screen all the time, right? And my youngest, the 10-year-old, loves to play Minecraft. He's on the Minecraft all the time.
Oh, mine too.
And we just bought a blacksmith shop for the craft school, and I was negotiating on the phone a used anvil, and he heard me. And he said, Mom, everything made on an anvil's enchanted, right? I said, what? Yeah, everything made on an anvil's enchanted. And my brain just went, oh, crafting. And so we have a whole series through June and July, every Saturday, starting June 12th, where they make in real life. It takes them off the screen and puts them in the shop with master artisans, and they make in real life that stuff they make on the game to hopefully to get them engaged with their culture, yeah. So, and it's pay what you can, and so everybody can participate. So if you got kids, check that out. That's my big plug.
Great plug.
is that it?
Well, in Hardy, they have had in the past, the first weekend of October, the homesteaders and the people that used to do that have decided they don't want to do that anymore. So that's in transition right now into how to make the next iteration be accessible, desirable for the public. That's sort of in transition right now. So I'm loving hearing what you're saying, because we need to pull this information and that history of that group to make something that's gonna keep alive some of those crafts, those folk crafts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So I'm happy to help y'all. I'm happy to help y'all through this process any way that you want me to. Just let Virginia know, and we want to put together this thing about the Traveler in particular. Just let me know, and I'm happy to come.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Any other questions or comments?
Well, it's been a pleasure to visit with y'all. And again, I'm so excited that you got this opportunity. And I'm so excited that you're able to work with Virginia because she's an amazing resource. And I mean, that's the definitive thing. I keep a pile of about 25 of those. Just anytime I need them, I can hand them out because it's the really concise thing to start you on your journey. So I know that y'all are going to do a great job, and I can't wait to hear what you come up with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm gonna go. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
All right, so we go till 8. Do y'all need a few minutes of a break, or you just want to steamroll through?
Maybe break?
Nobody
No.
can stand up.
No, I think we're ready to go.
All right, well, yeah, if you need to stand up or step away though, please just go ahead and do it. So as Rachel shared, and I think she cut off a little bit, but the booklet she was talking about, the resource she was talking about there at the end is the Library of Congress booklet that Angela is sharing with you all. You can actually contact the Library of Congress and they'll send you physical copies for free. Yes, exactly. I wanted to have physical copies for y'all, but COVID. They also have them in Spanish too, just FYI. So the second part of this presentation is, so Rachel's really started the conversation in talking about what folklore and folk life is, but you know, if you go to the American Folklore Society and ask them for a definition of folklore, they don't actually even have one concise definition. They have a page of different definitions over the years because it's one of those things that we all have, but it's really kind of hard to describe. So just to add to Rachel's perspective, I work for Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts. Every state has a state folk arts program in some shape or form. And when I say folk arts, we use the language of arts because we are funded primarily by the National Endowment for the Arts. So, but what we're talking about isn't different from what Rachel was just sharing. It's folklore and folk life. It's tradition that's shared and learned within communities. And it's rooted in communities. And like Rachel said, it's not something you learn in a textbook. It's something you learn from other people in your community. And she was spot on in pointing out that community can mean different things for each of us. And we all have communities. So there's geographic locations, there's religious communities, there's age cohorts, right? And that even becomes more literal when you're in school, right? There's sophomore culture is different from the senior culture. It might be interests. So, you know, quilting, that's a community. It could even be online nowadays. The internet has really challenged folklorists to think about what community actually can even mean for people, because people do make meaningful connections online. So community can mean a lot of things for a lot of people. And we as individuals are simultaneously in a variety of communities at any given moment. So, you know, I'm a member of my family. I'm a native Ohioan, but I also live in Arkansas. So of course I'm part of an Arkansas community, but I also, you know, I'm interested in this activity. So I have friends from that. I have, you know, my old high school alumni, you know, I'm part of a lot of different groups at one time. So a lot of the traditions that my communities hold to are so self-evident to me that you don't even think of them as remarkable when you're in the group. So I think one of the biggest challenges for public folklorists is getting people to even see that their traditions and their stories are exciting. And I sort of derailed myself. So as a folk arts program, we use the language of arts, but really what we're talking about is tradition with some sort of skillful component. It's art because the community says, this is a good example of this tradition, and this is maybe a less skilled example of that tradition. You're, through this project, not limited to thinking about folk arts, but I'm just explaining sort of what we come from. So for instance, you know, there could be 100 quilters, but the community is going to say, oh, so-and-so is the legend though. She's the quilter you go to if you really want to know how to do it. And that's not something that I, as the folklorist, decide. I don't get to say who's the master artist there. The community decides that. And that doesn't have to be, you know, a lot of the folks that I work with would never, ever call themselves artists. So I think the more appropriate term would be tradition bearer, right? So someone who has knowledge that's worth passing on. And actually that's all of us, but there's just some people are sort of more known for different traditions than others. So let me put on my PowerPoint. And so I think you've got a firm idea, but just to also sort of sum up some of the things Rachel was saying. So with this in mind, folklore and folk life can be everything from stories, music and dance. It could be holidays, festivals, rituals. It could be food, craft. You know, this craft is, I think, the thing you usually think of, craft and music. But it could be knowledge, you know, how to make something. It could be intangible, right? How to get to a certain place. You have to be a local to know. It could be belief. So folklore is so much broader, I think, than sort of that word sort of stirs up sort of a stereotype idea of what folklore is, but it's much broader than that. And going back to this idea of whether it's true or false, it's not that it's not important. It's more that what's important is why this is something that the community embraces, right? So I think folklore is a really interesting thing because every age group has it, so you can connect with people through folklore. So an example I always like to give, I'm less familiar with your area than Rachel is, but is there somewhere that's sort of famous for being haunted, so people will go and like try to check it out?
Hardy Hotel was supposedly haunted because of a murder.
Oh,
Bigger's Bluff, Bigger's Steakhouse might pick up on that.
Yeah.
yeah.
The Rock House there by where we go to church.
Yeah.
There was something written about that in the lady that it was in one of the local magazines.
Well, I said I had my office in Hardy. They had the paranormal collection where it go through the Hardy Hotel.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
Yeah.
I like that as an example because I remember being young and at a sleepover and whispering about stories about local places that were supposedly haunted in my community. So to have that as a point of connecting with an adult, I would have been all in because that was something I was already interested in. And for folklorists too, there's this term we use called legend tripping, and that's where you go somewhere because of a legend. Or you do something because of a legend. So like playing Bloody Mary, that is legend tripping. You heard this legend about what happens if you stand in a bathroom and say Bloody Mary. Again, you don't read that in textbook. You heard that from your peers. And the magic of folklore is somehow that gets told amongst peer groups all across the country. And so you go in the bathroom to see what will happen. Another example of folklore sort of really being so widespread is, I think, so someone from, I think it was KUAF, wanted to talk with me about a legend of a woman in white along a roadside and how cool that story was to this location. And I said, it is cool, but you do realize like every community across the country has a woman in white story, or a hitchhiker, right? Or vanishing hitchhiker, or a crybaby bridge. So I'm not trying to just limit us to this supernatural sort of realm of folklore, but my point is that every age group has folklore, so it's finding points of connection between those things. I think you can really mobilize people and get even like younger people excited when you sort of connect with the traditions that they value, which are just equally valid. You know, where do younger groups hang out in the area? Why do they hang out in certain areas? So I guess that's a little like, it's challenging with the internet, but it was a little more clear cut for me when I was the generation right before the internet, so we were still running around outside a lot. All right, so I've talked a little bit more on what Rachel said. So the next part of our training session is to talk then about, okay, so you've identified some different kinds of folklore traditions in your community. What do you do with that? How do you document that? And there's a variety of ways of documenting tradition. But as you can probably guess by the nature of folklore, it isn't necessarily in a textbook. Or if you find folklore in a book, it's probably an outdated version of folklore. It's not necessarily the story as it's being told today. It's sort of a snapshot of folklore in the past, not necessarily folklore in the present. The best way to document folklore is to get out there and actually talk to people who have it, which is, again, everyone in the community has folklore. So for this second half, and we might run out of time, and that's okay, because I've built some more time in the second session to continue this conversation. But for this second half, I want to talk about different ways of doing field work to document folklore. And then the most sort of the prime example of that, sort of our number one tool, is the oral history interview. So we'll talk about what that is and how to sort of effectively create an oral history experience. It's not necessarily as straightforward as it seems. And then I've already shared this, but just to reiterate who I am. So we are dedicated to building cross-cultural understanding by documenting, presenting, and sustaining Arkansas's living traditional arts and cultural heritage. So I do some of this field work myself, and I do public programming like Rachel talked about as a public folklorist. But I think probably the most important part of my job is the sustain part. And that's creating experiences like this, where it's creating sort of resources and tools for communities to do this work themselves. If I just, do an exhibit here or there, it's neat, but it's not necessarily sustaining. And another way that we do that is we offer a master apprenticeship program. So each year we will be able to provide funding to a master artist or tradition bearer. It's a stipend, so that way they, over the course of that year, will have a little bit of funding to be able to pass on whatever their expertise is onto someone else in their community. So those applications will actually open up in the next week or so, but we'll be able to fund 5 apprenticeships this year. So again, how do we document folk and traditional arts? So field work in all its forms for us is firsthand observation. This is probably literally taken from the Library of Congress guide that you'll read, but field work is using different tools like cameras and audio recorders to record and document what we see and hear. Part of that, quite frankly, is participant observation. I think sitting down and talking with someone and joining them in what they're doing is a valuable way of learning. And that doesn't necessarily even have to be accompanied with photography and interviewing. A lot of times in my work, I sit down with an artist and get to know them over the course of a period of time before I then come back and say, hey, would you mind if I document or record you doing this? Because I only really know sometimes how I'd like to document it only after I've spent time with them, getting to know their process and their way of seeing the world and how they do things. So participant observation too, it's more than just sort of standing on the sidelines and watching. It's getting in there and actually being part of the process. If you're working with someone who's the best bread baker in town, it's maybe standing next to them in the kitchen and handing them the ingredients as they ask for it. It's really sort of being part of that process. Because of that experience, during that experience, you could be taking notes or journaling, or sometimes what people do is they wait until the experience is over, they get home, and as soon as they get home, they write down everything they can remember as fast as they can. That can be quite tedious, and I'll be honest, it tends to be sort of more of an old school way of doing field work. Field notes are still very valuable, but it's not something I'm going to necessarily emphasize here today. The 2 things that I think are best for documentation right now, something that will live well in an archive and will also be something you can use for presentations and programming, is photography and video, and then oral history interviews itself. And the oral history interviews can be video, but more often than not, we recommend it. It's sort of strange. Oral historians are kind of are sort of adverse to video, and I'm not sure exactly why, but I think part of it is that audio files are easier to keep safe over time than a video file itself. So I think it's about sort of the preservation of the process. And I will say too, if you're videotaping someone while you're interviewing them, there's a whole added layer of sort of self-consciousness that audio takes away. Any questions so far? Okay. And oral history interviewing holds a special place in my heart as well, because I think it's important to collect as we go rather than wait. And even folklorists, we're guilty of this. We end up interviewing people sort of when we feel like we're most at risk of losing them. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can interview someone who's in their 20s about what it's like to live during COVID-19. It doesn't mean you can't, I mean, you could still interview them when they're older, 2 decades from now. It'll be just as valuable, because I guarantee you those interviews from the same person will be very different interviews. Because for oral historians, part of that layer is how people make meaning out of their experiences. And so what I encourage you to think about too is contemporary collecting. So this is actually from a museum talking about tangible objects, but they define contemporary collecting as the process through which museums identify and acquire contemporary, tangible and intangible culture in order to preemptively fill anticipated gaps in museum collections. The idea of getting it now while you still can. And that becomes all the more important when we're talking about knowledge that only lives on through people. It's not written down on a textbook. It lives in people's heads and their memories and their jokes and their stories. So collecting while we can is all the more important. And this is pulled straight from that textbook that you all will see. The field worker. So you all, if you go out and use these skills to document people's traditions and stories, you all are the first archivist. Here at the American Folklife Center, the statement is downright proverbial. When we say this, we mean that the fieldworker's actions often determine if a collection is safe and accessible. Our archive has some very old and important collections whose fieldworkers did not provide essential information, such as names and places. And it's very hard for researchers or even trained archivists to find the items they need. And so that's why this training exists too, because anyone can sit down with a recorder and interview a neighbor. But what I am hoping you'll take away from this training is the skills to make sure you add that extra information, you contextualize it, and you get these files. Even if you don't take them to an archive, if you store them in your own home, you're storing them in a way that someone who finds them later can interpret them and know what they mean. And I have a puppy, by the way, that's scratching things right now. So if you hear that, I'm sorry.
And he's very happy.
If I lock him up, he'll be even louder. So he's like scratching his bed right now. So it seems easy, but what is an oral history? It's a recorded dialogue between two people that captures personal memories of historic significance. And I don't want the word historic significance to scare you. It doesn't mean it's like textbook worthy. It means that it would be interesting for the historical record, which is a lot of things. Some oral historians, the oral historian is a field proper. When they are doing an oral history, they're looking for facts as remembered by people. I am going to challenge you to think about it like folklorists think about, which means that we are less interested in whether or not they're telling us facts, meaning we then fact check their dates and make sure they've got it all right. We're less interested in that and more interested in how the stories and memories they're sharing with us are meaningful to them. Why are these memories that they'd like to share? why are they, what does that mean to them? It's sort of as they've grown up, or what does that mean to them to belong to different communities they belong to? How have traditions or stories sort of helped form who they are? We're less interested in concrete facts. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I also wanted to challenge you to think about historic significance as something that's not necessarily in the past too. COVID-19 is of historic significance, and we've been doing an oral history project since last March, sort of as we go with folks about what it's been like to live in Arkansas during COVID-19. And even already there are details about what it was like to live in quarantine that we're losing because they're no longer new to us. Like what it was like to try to find a mask when you couldn't find them anywhere. So people were really relying on the help of folks who were quilters or sewers, which by the way, traditional knowledge, to make them for them. Or I use this example because I don't know why I find it fascinating. The fact that the McDonald's has a limited menu. These little details are already pretty mundane for us, but I guarantee you, if we could have that knowledge about what it was like to live like from the Great Depression, we'd be interested in it. So it's remembering that some of the most mundane parts of our life are actually of historic significance. And it's not even things far away, it's things happening now. And I should note too that memory is a factor, a scientific reality, which is why I think it's important to interview people of all ages at different stages of life. Because you will, if an oral history is about how you make meaning out of something, how a teenager is making meaning out of living through COVID-19 now is going to be different than how it is when they're an adult looking back on it. It'll be different. So there's value in collecting interviews from anyone that you think's work, that you're interested in now, regardless of age. In case you're worried, I'm not an oral historian. That is absolutely okay. You can still capture. I have your family stories. That was from an old PowerPoint, sorry. Anyone in your community stories. So this next part is about doing oral history interviews specifically. What's really cool and not common for projects that I do is that Cherokee Village has purchased recording equipment for oral history interviewing that will stay in your community. So this kind of work can happen long-term. So I'm going to talk about this, over the next 3 weeks. It doesn't have to just be for this Our Town grant. That equipment's going to live there. So I challenge you to not even think about this as a short-term project, but it's sort of a way of living and doing as you go forward in your careers. People don't do oral histories enough. Like I said, they tend to wait for the 11th hour when they're worried they're going to lose someone. So if you want to do an oral history interview or a project where you interview multiple people, here are some important questions before you begin. Where will the interviews be archived, or will they be archived? I mean, it's okay if you don't necessarily have a desire to put them in an archive, but in that case, we'll talk next week about how can you store them safely yourself. But if you do want to have them archived, that's an important consideration because that archive might have its own paperwork. So related to that, what type of paperwork is required? What kind of equipment will you use? This is a lot more of an open-ended question when I do this kind of presentation for other locations and communities, but what kind of equipment will you use? You can answer that. Who will you interview? What will the interviews be about? What questions will you ask? And then importantly, how much time do you have? Because oral history interviewing isn't quick. You're asking people to open up and share their memories with you, which is actually hard work, a lot harder than people give it credit for. And it takes time. So you need to set aside time to do this work. So I'm going to mention briefly what type of paperwork is required in a general form, but we'll revisit this in future sessions. In general, if you're going to archive interviews that you do, you'll want the interviewee to sign a release form, or sometimes they're called deed of gift or waivers, giving permission for the oral history interview to be deposited into an archive. Even if you are not going to immediately put an interview in an archive, it's still good practice for you to create some sort of release form that's the interviewee telling, writing down that they give you permission to record them. Could be as simple as that. The back of your booklet, your folk life and fieldwork booklet, actually has sample versions of what a release form could look like. Related to that, you're going to want to have some form of metadata. And what I mean by that is, say your interview file is separated and just exists by itself floating in an archive, and they're like, well, I have the voices, but I don't know who, what, when, where, what, like, why was this interview conducted or who did it? The metadata exists to answer those questions. Who participated in the interview? Like, what kind of equipment even did they use? Because that could help preservationists figure out how to best, take care of the files. So, where was it? Where did the interview take place? Importantly, what date did the interview take place? Metadata is also important because if you think about, I always tell people as much or as little as they'd like to share with me is great, but the more information I have for metadata, the better. I'm from a family of several Virginia Seagulls. I'm a granddaughter of a Virginia Seagull. So anytime I'd go to a bank or a doctor, they'd get really confused. So an example of having a middle name makes a world of difference. So for archivists as well, which Virginia Seagull. And then any extra documentation that you collect while you're doing interviews is awesome. If you want to snap a few photos while you're doing before or after an oral history interview, great. More context, if it's part of an event, providing more context about what that event is, any kind of extra information is awesome and fantastic. So what kind of equipment will you use? Next week, we'll talk about the recorders specifically purchased by Cherokee Village and how to use them. But just in general, as a rule of thumb, if you're no longer living in Cherokee Village and you want to think about what kind of equipment to use, your comfort level, honestly, is the most important thing, because you can have a really expensive recorder that does everything, but that doesn't mean you need everything or that you know how to use everything. I'll even be honest, I have a recorder that's super fancy for my job, and I know how to use about 10% of it. 10% of it works for me. It gets the job that I need to get done, but you don't necessarily need all that extra features. And then obviously related to that, what can you afford or borrow? And I just wanted to remind you that nowadays, your phone is almost just as good of a quality as a lot of recorders on the market these days. Smartphones these days are pretty incredible. But this is kind of the range of different recording equipment nowadays that people use. The recorder in the middle is the one we'll talk about next week. That's the recorder that Cherokee Village has purchased several sets of. And then I would never have said this before COVID, but COVID has caused us, to think about fieldwork differently, because we had a whole year where we couldn't collect interviews in person. It wasn't safe. And so oral historians as a whole, as a profession, on the fly, we're trying to figure out best practices for doing interviews remotely. And so there is a whole new world of literature out there now that didn't exist before COVID about how to do these interviews through things like Zoom or Google Hangouts, and how to do them as safely and as effectively and as ethically as possible. And I included that quote, the director of Folk and Traditional Arts at the NEA, really early on in the pandemic. A lot of people were panicking about what can we get done? What can we get done? And he was like, well, we can only do what's possible and what's safe. And I just find that to be such a comfort. So, even in times long past COVID, you have to do what's, I challenge, it's important for you to think about what's possible and what's safe. You never want to go into an unsafe situation. You never want to push yourself beyond your comfort level, and you especially never want to push your interviewee past their comfort level too. So I think it's a good rule of thumb in general. Okay, so you've identified an interviewee. The first thing you want to do when you talk with them is be clear and transparent about the process. Because I mentioned earlier that interviews are not quick, they're not quick things. Sometimes I'll work with someone who's like, oh, I've got like 20 minutes on Thursday, will that work? And it's like, no, that's not going to work. We need to set, clear expectations about how much time you'd like them to set aside. I would say a good rule of thumb for an interview is around 45 minutes. Some of my shorter interviews can last about 30 minutes. I never go past an hour and a half, and we'll talk about that here in a second. I say conduct a pre-interview. That doesn't mean you have to record it or write down anything. That's more if you're interviewing someone you don't know very well. When you schedule the interview with them, go ahead and ask them a little bit about them to find out sort of how you want to focus your interview. That's going to help you draft your questions. And then after you've set your interview, develop your questions. So this is a sticky point that I get questions about questions a lot, which is, can I share, my interviewee wants to see my questions in advance. Can I share that with them? In general, I would recommend that you do not share questions in advance, but maybe topics or key themes that you'd like to address. And part of that is, with an oral history interview, what we're trying to do is create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing their memories, and sort of there's like a story realm that people slip into. You can tell when they're sort of on a vibe where they're sort of past the niceties and they're really in that groove of sharing and remembering and reflecting. And you're trying to create an environment that's comfortable for people to do that. So when you share questions in advance, though, people are automatically rehearsing what they're going to say. And you lose a lot of nuance too when people are rehearsing what they're going to say. That said, sometimes people really want them. And I think it's okay to share, if that's the case, you can share a list with them. But the problem is that oral history interviews are directed by the interviewee. They may take the topic in a different direction than the question you asked. So even if you share your list of questions with them, you need to warn them that that doesn't mean you're going to stick to those questions or that you're even going to get to all those questions. I've had interviewees where you ask them one question and 45 minutes fly by. And then I've had interviews where you get through your list of questions and the first 20 minutes, and then you're just kind of going on tangents based on things that they've told you. Both scenarios could happen. So sharing a list of questions can be misleading because they may not be what you stick to. And then, think through the location of your interview. I work with a lot of students who oftentimes are overachievers and they're worried about making everything perfect. And this whole process is challenging for students because there's no way to make an interview perfect because you're working with a lot of unknowns and you're also working with other, human beings that you don't necessarily know how an interview is going to go. And related to that, we try to strive for the best sound quality that we can for archival purposes, but you can't control an environment perfectly. You just can't. So when I say think through a location for an interview, what you're looking for is somewhere that's quiet, as quiet as it can be, and private. But you also want somewhere that's comfortable for your interviewee, somewhere where they feel safe and able to open up and share with you. But then also somewhere where you can set up an equipment. There's a lot of variables to think about. I mentioned as quiet as you can. There are some oral historians who would tell you sort of like, no, it needs to be exactly quiet. I even had a boss who once asked someone to turn off their refrigerator because it was making noise. And his compromise with them was he would put his keys in the refrigerator so they'd remember to turn it on when he left. I don't think you should go to those extremes because you're trying to make your interviewee comfortable. I don't think you should worry about having the sound quality be perfect, but I want you to think about it. So you've got all those variables set, you've got a location, you've got your questions ready to go. Right before the interview, you need to make sure you have all your paperwork ready to go. If you're doing this on your own, that's if a release that maybe you've created yourself, or if you know you want to deposit into an archive, it's checking what their paperwork requirements are and making sure you have all those things ready to go. And then absolutely, even if you've tested it when you first got it, test your equipment the night before. That way you can get all your settings where you want them. And we'll talk about this next week. You can even test sort of what it sounds like when you're standing like this far away or this far away. You can play with that a lot easier on your own than when you're sort of scrambling. And in my case, oftentimes nervous to get an interview started. And then you're kind of fiddling with all these things on top of it. You want to make the process as smooth and easy as possible for both you and your interviewee. Any questions so far? Okay. Related to that, this is a list that I always check before I do an interview. Do I have a digital recorder and all the all the bells and whistles that go with that? Which means like, do I have extra batteries? Do I have all my cords, my headphones, things like that? Do I have all my paperwork? If it's for a project, I also always check if I have some sort of written explanation that I could leave with someone. I can't tell you how many times working in an archive, I've had someone say, I did an interview like 5 years ago. A young lady came by and interviewed me, but I don't remember what it was for. So leaving them some sort of paper about what this was for is useful if you feel to. Make sure you have a notebook and a pen and pencil with you. And then something I learned the hard way in rural Kentucky is make sure you have your directions written out if you're going somewhere where your GPS is going to fail you. So I always make sure I have directions and phone numbers in my kit ready to go. So you're at your interview, you've got your equipment set up. Again, we'll talk about that next week. So I'm sort of glossing over the equipment part. You and your interviewee are comfortable. Maybe you probably have done some chit-chatting on your own before you ever hit record, just to sort of get to know each other or talk about the weather or whatever. But you settle in and you're ready for the interview to start. What I always do is start the recording by giving some sort of introduction. Part of that is it sets sort of the tone for your interviewee that we're getting started. You also want to think about what happens if this file is ever just randomly separated and out of context. An introduction helps someone who's listening to that recorder know the who, what, when, where that we were talking about before. So I usually try to state who we are, where we're at, and what the date is, and if it's for a project, even what that project is. So for instance, I would say, my name is Virginia Siegel with Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts. I am here with Jonathan, and we are sitting at his home here in Cherokee Village. It is June 1st, 2021. Thank you so much for being here with me, Jonathan. Something like that. And if you want to play it safe, you can even say, Jonathan, I just want to double check if I have your permission to record our conversation. So that way, if your paperwork ever gets separated, you have that line of protection there. And then I'd ask a softball question first. I had a oral historian, sorry, my dog is pulling on my sweater right now as we speak. I don't know if you can see me jerking this way. I had a friend who said, why not ask a question they can't get wrong first, which is sort of, I mean, it was a joke because in an oral history interview, they can't get anything wrong. It's about them and their stories. But I usually start with, tell me about where you grew up. And the key is to start a trend of long answers. So I don't necessarily. What was that?
Baby wants your attention.
He does. So a trend of long answers. An example of that would be, I don't ask, where did you grow up? I'd say, tell me about where you grew up. See the difference there? You're asking, there's an opportunity there, a window of opportunity for people to share more than just a one-word answer. So that trend of long answers. And related to that, at the bottom, it goes with avoiding closed-ended questions. I'm always telling students to not sweat it when they leave the interview feeling like, oh man, I did it wrong, because it's just, you're never going to have a perfect interview. And I've had every kind of variable possible. And I've had one where early on, when I hadn't practiced that idea of avoiding closed-ended questions, who would just go, yep. You're like, oh, come on, tell me something more. So a way to avoid that is the way you craft your questions in the first place. And that sets a tone and creates an environment that encourages people to share, I think even sort of subconsciously. And related to that, ask one question at a time. These are rules of thumb. When you're in the moment, you might not actually think of some of these things, and that's okay. But these are things for you to consider, because I have a bad habit of being like, tell me about where you're from. You're from Mountain View, right? What was it like to grow up in the Ozarks? Suddenly that's 3 questions, compounding them. So think about one question at a time, but if you don't, if you find yourself sort of slipping into regular talk, don't worry about it either. I mean, just your comfort, your interview's comfort is first and foremost. Perfection is not. I mean, related to that, this is also something I find very challenging, is confirming you are listening non-verbally. So remember that your interviews are being recorded, and ideally the recordings are as clean and well sounded. I don't know if that's a phrase, that we can get them. And if you think about, so for instance, an instance in an interview on NPR, the more it's interrupted with, oh, that's interesting, it's harder for them to have those sound bites to use. So I end up doing these like really, I probably look silly, but doing like these vigorous head nods, just trying everything I can not to do a lot of verbal responses, because that's my normal. So it's hard, but it's something for you to think about. Related to that, I don't have a bullet point for this, but even like I've interviewed someone who's like clicking their pen the whole time, or like banging their hands on the table. Some of these things you can't control, but if you can control them, keep an eye out for them. Like for instance, if they're things that you would do. We've got about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to use this slide and then we'll wrap up and save the rest of it for next week. But a few more tips during the interview. First of all, be okay with silence. I don't know about you all, but I'm from the Midwest and my family is not okay with silence. We fill it. But you're going to lose something if you don't wait that extra uncomfortable beat, because sometimes people are thinking, they're processing as they go. If you really are in that right sort of vein, they're reminiscing, they're thinking, they're processing, they're wondering what things mean to them as they go, and they need time to think. And oftentimes, when you wait that extra uncomfortable beat, someone will continue their thought because they think you're expecting them to continue. So they'll add to it. Whereas if you'd interrupted them, you would have lost that extra thought. So really be okay with that silence. And related to that, sometimes you might ask a question and they take it a completely different direction. That's okay too, because there's something to be discovered there, right? They took it a different direction for a reason. There's something they wanted to tell you. So rather than interrupting them, let them sort of take you on that journey. And if you want to jot down sort of on your notepad, make sure to return to my question, great. You could always say, wow, that's so interesting. And that reminds me of the, what I was going to ask earlier. Do you mind sharing X, Y, Z? There's ways to go back to your question without sort of derailing them. Let them take you on the journey in the interview. You're creating open-ended questions where they can sort of take it where they want to go. And that's actually sort of a kernel of trauma-informed oral history, is creating sort of a journey with multiple pathways. So if you're ever interviewing someone who's experienced trauma, that's a good way to go, because maybe one pathway leads to memories of trauma and you're giving them the opportunity to avoid that or go down whatever road they choose. So it's in general just a good practice to create open-ended questions and let the interviewee take you where they want to go. Sometimes that means you don't necessarily get everything you want. That's okay too. Again, you can always, at the end of the interview, go back through questions you want better addressed. Sometimes you're just not going to get what you thought you were going to get out of an interview, but that doesn't mean the interview is any less valuable. It's just something else than what you thought it was going to be. That's very true when you're interviewing people about folklore, because folklore is intertwined in everything that we do. So you might start with talking about a certain kind of holiday cookie, but that turns into the holiday itself and getting together with family and other rituals that people do and what it's like to be a part of a community, and all of these other things bubble up from a single instance of folklore. And that's okay, because all those things are equally interesting. So again, write down follow-ups and return to them later and ask for specific examples. Part of that is the limitations of the technology, right? If you have someone, maybe they're like, the boat was like yay big. Well, a recorder doesn't know what yay big is. So one of the things you can do is say, oh, so like 4 feet, is that what you're estimating? You can sort of use your response to put that into the recording so the recording has it. But that tip also works for things like acronyms. So say you're interviewing someone who was in the military in World War II, and they mention like, I'm not a military person, like what unit they were from, or like the acronyms for this or that. And, doesn't necessarily mean audiences are going to know what those acronyms are. So don't be afraid to be like, even if you can't get a word in at the end of the interview, even if you go, hey, before we wrap up, I just wanted to confirm with you, you'd mentioned this acronym. Can you tell me what that acronym stands for? Just so you have those things in mind. The key here is to remember that even if you are close to the interviewee and you're close to the subject matter, the person listening to the audio recording isn't necessarily. So the challenge is sort of thinking about how this would sound to someone outside of the situation, someone who's not from Cherokee Village or the area. Do they necessarily know what acronyms are? It's okay if you don't catch them all. It's just something to think about. And then most importantly, look for signs of exhaustion. Memory work is a lot harder than people give it credit for. I never have an interview go over an hour and a half, even if it feels like we could keep going forever. Just out of the consideration of my interviewee, I usually say something along the lines of like, wow, we could go on forever, but I don't want to keep you. Would you be interested in doing a part 2 where we pick up where we left off? Maybe we can schedule something for next week. And usually the interviewee will be like, oh, okay, yeah, actually, that would be really great. Part of that too is even the most innocuous things can lead to a lot of, important memories. I interviewed a quilter once who she quilted in memory of her brother, which brought up really hard memories, and she needed a break. Even in the middle of an interview, you're only 20 minutes in and someone needs a break, let them have a break. You never sacrifice their comfort for the interview itself. You interviewee first. I think that's where we can stick for today because we're running out of time. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Good session.
Oh, yeah, lots of stuff.
Is there anything related to that? Is there anything you thought we'd address today that we haven't? Because I can always move around things in the future.
No, I
Everything was
think,
good.
yeah, it's lots of good information.
Great. Well, if you think of things,
My brain is overloaded with ideas.
We're exhausted, speaking of.
I know it. I know. Well,
Good.
a lot of this is going to be in that booklet, and this PowerPoint, this presentation itself, I'll upload to that website link I mentioned earlier. So it's all there. So it's something you can always revisit. If you have any questions or thoughts or things you'd like me to address in the meantime, even between sessions, just let me know. I do have a little bit of homework for you if you're up to the challenge. Obviously, you're not getting graded on this, so you could decide not to do it. But let me skip ahead. Okay, so I mentioned if you would read pages 1 through 17 in the Folk Life and Fieldwork booklet. That's about half the size, that's about half the booklet. So it's pretty short. Related to that, I'd ask that you brainstorm one tradition in your community that you'd like to learn more about. And think about who you'd interview about that and why. Now, you could do that the opposite way. You could say, I would like to know more about this person. What would I ask them about their life? That's okay too. So you could start by who would I like to interview, or more like what would I like to know about? With that in mind, draft a list of questions that would get you started. In a real interview, you wouldn't even have to stick to them. I think the process itself, though, is just important for thinking about how you would ask the questions. And then I mentioned this before, but if you have any, jot down any questions you have from this session or anything we didn't cover, if you think of it, and we'll make sure to address it in future sessions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a fantastic group. I was nervous myself because this is the first of its kind, but you all are making my job easy, and I'm just so grateful that you all will be our first cohort of community scholars. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
John,
We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Have a good evening. Thanks for spending the evening with me.
Oh.
All right. Well, I'm going to sign out. Angela, I'm going to send you that link and the homework stuff just in case, so you can forward it to everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.